Hey guys, welcome to chART, where we chat about art. Today, join us to talk about what a movement is and what exactly can you consider a movement, at least according to our opinion. Stay tuned.
We are Finn, Mara, Javier, and Christy, and thank you for tuning in to listen to chART podcast. We are so stoked to have you here with us and that you take some time out of your day to hear us discuss any things that are happening in the art world. Without further ado, let's jump into the episode. Let's roll.
Hi guys, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I just woke up.
That's a lie. It's it's like 12:30 where you are.
Yeah,
You underestimate my powers.
Yeah, probably.
it depends on what time you sleep, right?
I think I went to bed like at 5 a.m.
What is wrong with
Why
you?
do you stay up so late?
I get productive at night. And yesterday I had to just write. And I was like typing with my eyes red. And then it was like 4:30 a.m. And I was like, but I haven't read yet. So I had to go to bed and like open my ebook and read for some, like for a bit to feel the day complete. So I ended up going to bed at like 5 a.m. or something.
Wait, so you have to read before going to bed?
Yeah, it's
I
like
do that too.
I have to read when I go to bed and first thing in the morning at least 20 minutes because otherwise my day just doesn't work.
That's so weird. If I read, I fall asleep straight away.
That's the point. Like when you're awake
That's
at
why-
5 a.m., you need to read to fall asleep. Otherwise, you're just like,
Yeah, true.
But then, what if you read in the morning when you wake up?
Yeah.
but reading in the morning is more like a chill thing. It's like, I don't know. You don't
It's
listen
like having
to
your coffee in the morning. It's kind
Yeah.
of the same feeling.
you don't listen
Yeah,
to
but with
black metal
podcasts.
straight out of bed. You do that like,
When you're having a shower.
yeah, after you have a shower. Like I
No,
do that
when during.
during. I don't know
Yeah.
about during. What I do is I listen to calm music when I'm waking up, and when I get to the bus to Sotheby's or class or whatever, I blast the loudest metal I have. Be human again.
Hmm.
Tips for life.
Same, but with
Interesting.
Britney.
On the tube, singing along with Toxic.
Yes, but yeah.
I'm literally walking with a latte, obviously, but also late to the lecture
Every
with You
time.
Better Work playing.
Lovely.
Okay,
We have
let's
gathered-
begin.
So let's start asking the question: how each of us perceives, like, what do you think a movement is? Like before you go into Wikipedia or whatever and see what
Specifics.
definition is. Like before you inform yourself about it, what was a movement for
A
you?
movement, for me, is when a particular group of artists, mostly like a smaller group, were having a similar strain of thought or an idea or a vision that they would work around in their practice that was usually different from what the majority of artists were doing, and they brought over this new idea or this new vision through their work or through a manifesto to the larger audience. What do you guys think?
Oh.
In
Like
like
for me,
concise way of like describing it.
Or
I
saw
kind of
something
always
else?
saw it as like a group of. It's kind of like a revolutionary
Right.
situation within artists where they don't agree with what's going on, so they speak to people who also think that who also disagree with the general style or general consensus of how the artwork how the art world is going, and then they just try to make art that follows their line of thinking.
Okay.
And then when people discovered it, it got popularized because they realized that they also feel the same.
Yeah.
I agree with Christy. Few years ago at Tate, maybe Christy saw it. There was like a huge wall, like a kind of like a mural, and
Yeah.
they had all the names of the movements that have happened ever, the official ones. And I thought what was interesting at the time is that in my mind, a movement was literally like, we don't like what's been going on, we're going to start something new.
Mhm.
But in this like enormous, it was like, it looked a little bit like a mind map. You could see which movements were linked with which movements, and like which ones had like jumped off from another one, and there was not a single one which was like isolated or alone. They were
Yeah.
all, you know, from a different movement or a movement which was split into two. So it's definitely, I think, like an ongoing thing. And I think more recently, because movements, they tend to have like a quicker turnover,
Yeah.
it's really about like being avant-garde and like being the, you know, next best thing basically, and like totally changing the way people think, and, you know, having totally different thoughts from their predecessor.
Right. I think, could you explain what avant-garde is then?
Oh, avant-garde means when you have very forward-thinking thoughts, and I'm trying to think of the best way. Basically having a very forward-thinking way of either doing something or just your thoughts, and kind of breaking the boundaries of what was, you know, cool and different previously.
I think I would just call it like experimental and breaking the norms that were initially unacceptable.
Yeah.
It's kind of like protest, and like we can even just start with like being gay. It used to be seen as something that is abnormal. It used to be seen as a disease, and then people protest, or like as artists, they protest and they make it into something that is normal, that is acceptable, because that is just humans.
Well, to counteract, it's not that it immediately becomes the new norm. It takes,
well, yeah, it's a slow process.
It's a slow process. It has a lot of resistance in the beginning. If you like what you said with the example of just being gay and the whole and then the AIDS riots in the 80s in New York, it's not just a group of artists that come together and say, okay, this is what we're going to do now, and this is the new norm. It really takes a long time sometimes to get accepted, or just to get more into the normal sphere.
It's the criticism I had ready for all of you. The question of, of course, a lot of movements start the way you said. It's a manifesto, and you can really see a group of people who've come together thinking the same thing and putting it forward. But sometimes a movement is something that happens after different people have done the same thing, and they haven't really thought about it together, or it just happened, you know? Sometimes movements in art are something that are historically studied, and someone says, okay, so apparently these people did similar things at this point. Let's call that a movement.
I think maybe that would be considered more as an art period. And there's maybe a small difference, because we have an art period, like we are now in the contemporary art period.
Yeah.
You have the Egyptian art period, you have the Byzantine art period, where afterwards, 100 years after that period, we might think, okay, you know, these artists kind of did the same in the same context, in the same environment. We'll categorize them as an art, as the Egyptian art period, for example. But an art movement, I think, is hidden in, or is not hidden, but is embedded within the art movement. Because within contemporary art, you have performance art, you have minimalism, you have all those different movements, but they're categorized in contemporary art.
But then you have cases like Fauvism, for example, which it wasn't really a manifesto or anything. It was just a lot of artists who, because they were in a similar environment like Paris, which in the 19th century was the only place on the earth where you could basically do art and be someone in that world. But in Fauvism, a lot of artists just happened, well, probably not spontaneously, probably they knew each other. But the thing is that they all started using, so the definition of Fauvism is when you use a color that is not real for something that is. For example, when you paint a human and his face is green, or something like that. And the most known painting of Fauvism, I think it's called The Green Lady, and it's just it's a portrait of a woman with like a green line across her face.
Henri Matisse. Henri Matisse is technically also considered.
Or Matisse, yeah.
Yeah, Fauvism, and it's normally like during the 1900s, like 1900 till 1935.
Yeah.
The thing is, like what you said about it, but then it's not necessarily like a revolution, but then it's a product of what was happening before, which is
Right.
post-impressionism. So they're taking what they had before in post-impressionism, in terms of, you know, an impression of something, and then they try to further abstract the color, I feel like, with Fauvism, which renders it you no longer have to be realistic, or like the idea of, if we're moving away from rendering things realistically, what
Right.
happens if we make it completely unrealistic?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. But
I
my
think
point,
we
my
need
point
to-
was that when you like how Fauvism started is that someone put together an exhibition of these people who were doing this thing, and only after that happened, someone came to that exhibition, and there was a statue of. It was in a room, and of course, these things they weren't private galleries in the 19th century. It was more like someone with a fancy flat or a fancy apartment. They would lend artists to that. Is how it started, with people using their homes or houses that they weren't using to show artworks to a private audience. And when this happened, it was in a room of a really wealthy guy who was very progressive, clearly, because he was thinking already, let's give a chance to artists who are doing avant-garde in the 19th century. And in this room, there was this statue of Apollo in the middle, and the paintings were all like covering the walls around it. So when this journalist, this really traditionalist journalist came in, he saw the name of the article was Apollo surrounded by the beasts, and beast in French is fauve or fauve or however you pronounce it. So that's where Fauvism comes from. It's like beasts. So of course it builds on Impressionism and what they were doing before, but it wasn't a movement as a revolution. It was more like something that a lot of people were doing at the same time, amongst many other variations of Impressionism, and someone gave it so much publicity and importance with that article that they became a movement to be studied in history of art.
Can I just ask, I think we need to answer the question, or maybe elaborate on this idea of like a manifesto in art, because I think most people would think the manifesto is like a political thing.
Right.
And in art, they actually are very important, and even more in more recent art history, they were very important to movements and to putting all of your ideas in one place and explaining, you know, this is what we're about.
Yeah.
Because we've mentioned, we've used the word a few times now, and it seems like obviously integral to
So
movements.
I guess the broad definition of what a manifesto is just a compilation of thoughts, rules, and objectives for something. And you can apply that to politics like Marx did, or you can do it about anything really. So if you do it about a manifesto on arts, you're basically saying this movement is trying to do this through this, and this is the things that we think we have, like anyone these are kind of the requirements, although I don't really like to use that word for lack of a better one, but it's basically a way to distinguish what they're doing from what's happening already, and to make it clear that they're doing something new and they have an objective with it. It's not like, so we're just painting the sky orange,
But I
behold
think
our manifesto.
you then like you have movements where you look back and it makes sense, like Finn said, why it was a movement. Like, I'm not talking about a period of time, but how maybe some artists were focusing on a subject matter, and then you look
Right.
back and you give it a name. Whereas I think in more recent art history, like the 20th century, you think, okay, what are we about? And it's like very self-reflective, like that you already know what you are as a movement, rather than being named later on.
I think it's also because art suddenly became this thing where it's not only about painting realistically, but about, or like artists started incorporating politics into art. and that's why there is a more structured way of how artists want to formulate themselves as a movement, because especially in like recent years, like after World War One, there's just a strong notion of wanting change and wanting to, if you will, penetrate the system. So in order to do that, you have to kind of function like a lobbying party.
Yeah.
I mean, I still think actually that part of why that happens, why suddenly with contemporary art you have all this need to, well, not need, but it's what Finn says. Why do we talk about movements in contemporary art and not in the 16th century and stuff like that? I think one of the things why this happens is because the existence of modernism and happening at that time. So basically what modernism is the belief of one great narrative that everything has a place on, right? So if you talk about science, a modernist scientist would tell you there's a truth that can be reached through formulas and all that. Like there's one actual thing happening and you're just trying to get closer to it through problems and formulas and all that. When you talk about it in art, you say that there's one continuum in art themes and styles and movements and all that. So you fall into thinking that you fall into this perspective of thinking of a movement as this next step in a process, right? And I am more of the tradition in that aspect, which is what happened. Postmodernism happened after modernism, and it was basically saying there's no one narrative, there's just perspectives, and people the majority of people may be agreeing on one perspective, but it doesn't mean that it's real one, or it's just the most accepted at a given point in time. So I think that one important one aspect that really influenced this view of movements is, the use of manifestos and all these things. It subconsciously implies the belief that this normal thing, it's what it's. So just using the expression, what's new and against the norm, it implies that there's like this accepted thing that the modernists would say it's just what it is. When you
so
talk
like
about
postmodernism is like why we are beginning to accept flat earthers.
No. No, please don't be a flat earther. If you're a flat earther, unsubscribe right now. But
we accept everyone and all of their beliefs.
Yeah.
If you're a flat earther, that's cool.
That's fine.
Is
Definitely let us know in the comments if you are.
Let us know in the comments. We'll do a Twitter poll.
Are you a flat earther?
Or not?
Like art.
But basically the notion of, deconstructing comes with postmodernism. When you think about, I don't know, deconstructing the arts is what makes contemporary art so relevant.
I have a question. How come so many movements have a name and then later on it changes its name to like post something or abstract something?
I suppose like art historians trying to make it easier to understand, but also making sense of it. Because what if someone just started a movement right now and call it cup?
Post cup.
And then they realize actually it's not about the cup movement, it's about mundanity.
Wow.
Okay.
Okay. I see what you did there, right?
I feel like Christy is starting a new movement now. Okay.
Christy's starting a new movement called Cup. Subscribe.
Like and subscribe if you're from the Cup
Please
movement.
let us know what you think in the comments of Christy's movement, Cup.
Like so many, what I'm trying to say is like it might seem confusing to people looking, or hearing about movements and being like, how come there's one called Impressionism? Why is there one later called Post-Impressionism? Like why not call it something completely different if the ideas are so innovative that they change everything?
But then I think that is not necessarily a good example, because post-impressionism is basically an elaborated version of impressionism, where impressionism is about the quick impression of something. It's about like emotions and stuff, and post-impressionism is basically the same thing, but like there's a little bit more like symbolic or personal meaning in the paintings or in their works, or the impression of something is achieved by abstract forms, which impressionism haven't really done so yet.
Right.
Yeah.
And bear in mind that sometimes it's not post, it's pre.
Yeah.
Let us all remember good old pre-Raphaelites.
Yeah.
My favorite movement ever.
I love pre-Raphaelites. So beautiful.
I wasn't being ironic. I actually love them.
Yeah, I like them.
Pre-Raphaelites basically were a bunch of painters in the 19th century who thought that art was being corrupted by avant-gardes and had this really old-fashioned, romantically so, not like boring, but they really thought that art had lost its essence after Raphael. I don't know exactly why they pinpointed
Who's
the
Raphael?
meaning of corruption there.
Yeah,
Raphael
who's
was
Raphael?
a Renaissance artist.
Okay.
I'm trying to think of the School of Athens is by Raphael, right? That
Yeah,
painting with all the
That's,
philosophers and Plato and Aristotle in the middle.
I think what's more important is he painted the various libraries and buildings in the Vatican.
Right.
People might not know what the
I had actually
School of-
completely forgotten about those. I was thinking about his individual paintings. He's one of the big names of the Renaissance. He was there with Michelangelo.
Well, he was, I think, like in competition with Michelangelo, but like that kind of very important name in our history.
But they were all like contemporary with each other. They were all active at the same time in history. So I don't know exactly why they chose that one actually, but they must have a reason. And the point is that they kind of went back to doing this very figurative and they look old-fashioned when you look at them, but they have a very particular style. It's very hard to describe without like seeing one of their paintings, but it really imagine someone who has all the technique and craft of like having painted realistic paintings for three centuries in advance, and then going back to the same themes of like representing medieval scenes and stuff like that. So they look really realistic medieval scenes. That's basically what you see in most purified paintings. And they use a lot of themes like the King Arthur, and they go back to these very like unicorns and dames and ladies and wizards and stuff like that.
I think it's all very like imaginative. It's very
like whimsical.
I think it's more, I mean, it's kind of like a late
And
romanticism.
this is about the pre-Raphaelites, not Raphael.
We're talking about the pre-Raphaelites now. I think it's more of a version of romanticism where they go back to very realistic paintings. And instead of doing like this, it's not like William Turner that does this like huge storms and like sea waves and all that. What?
The Sublime.
The Sublime. It's more about this very like emotional and intimate moments of medieval.
I think also it's important to know that like in movements, sometimes, within the movement, although they don't change names, people have completely different thoughts on,
Yeah. Bear in mind that it's just a label.
Yeah.
It's just the need of people.
Let's just continue. I'm feeling your back.
Hello.
Hi. Sorry. Internet connections. Maybe the fox also bit at my internet.
Is
cable.
it raining where you are?
No.
My whole family are like, if the doors aren't open in the house, the Wi-Fi won't work. If it's raining outside, the Wi-Fi doesn't work. Like, if they have like 50,000 like conspiracy theories as to why the Wi-Fi doesn't work, and I'm like, it's just because we don't. I don't know. We have.
It's a Romanian thing.
I live in England. My dad is British.
Not in spirit, which is what matters. So
anyway, sorry, please continue. I'm back.
I think we were caught. It's really hard to think of movements as something rigid because, even if you say, I don't know, Manet is an impressionist artist, you can really dive into his work and wonder if he actually was one. And does he actually conform to all the norms of an impressionist artist and all that? And you can do this with very much, when you say what movement a painting or a bunch of works belong to, you always look at like the mean of them. How most impressionist paintings were about catching the light and impression and the quick and and all that. But then you have so much room for people who were not doing just that. They were trying to add more.
It's also important to distinguish Manet and Monet.
Extremely important.
The same period of time, Manet died a little bit earlier than Monet, but then Claude Monet and Ed Manet, they're both
Eddie for friends.
Eddie. They're both French, and they're both categorized as like impressionism, and they're basically alive during the same time.
But Monet's the one with the water lilies.
Yeah.
Right. Monet's basically the one who gave the movement the name because of his painting Impression Sunrise.
Yeah.
And then, but that's a very good point because they were contemporary, they were alive at the same time and everything. But you have like Monet doing this very, like like when you look at Impression Sunrise, it's basically a bunch of blue brush strokes and a sun in the middle. And then you look at Manet, and you look at, I think it's called Naked Lunch, like the book, right?
Naked Lunch, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Le Déjeuner sur
and then you look at Naked Lunch, which is basically, you can see this people, and it's like this, he has this realist like education, and you can see that. And
explain his style a bit, because I think everyone knows Monet as the guy who paints the
water lilies.
Yeah. I think Manet.
But even if you don't know, that's completely fine.
So Manet is this guy who really, I think Manet was very famous for being he was kind of like the renegade student of this guy called Meissonier. And Meissonier was the kind of like the director of Paris Academia for Arts at the time. And he was like, imagine like the most important realistic painter ever. Like he was a god to everyone in Paris who was studying the arts. And he basically told, Manet was the student that was like not really conforming with that, and he really wanted to do something new. And Meissonier, which is, by the way, the only artist who ever had a statue in the Louvre ever. He was so important, and now nobody knows his name.
Love it.
And he was, if you Google his paintings, he's basically this like photorealistic figures and scenes. There's one painting of Napoleon marching with his army, and like you can see every drop of mud in the hooves of the horses. So realistic. But then again,
what's Manet?
I'm getting there.
The thing is, like, Manet is also a person who brought about the transition from realism, talking about like his teacher who was really realistic in painting. He was pivotal in transitioning from realism into impressionism. But then when you look at his painting, it's not necessarily that, if you will, as abstracted compared to Monet. But
what's the difference between abstraction and abstracted?
Abstraction is pretty much things that you cannot name, like things that you don't have a name for. You can't quite,
like no object.
It could just be blobs of color. Most of abstract paintings are expressive colors, while abstracted forms would be this cup. I'm trying to paint this cup, but then I render it into this cup.
Like, basically, you can make out what it is, but it's not a realistic portrayal of that object. Okay, back to what Manet's like.
So my long monologue about his teacher was to say what Christy said, that Manet became kind of the spearhead of this movement of art, of this movement of artists that were trying to like bring new things to the table and use the realism as like a foundation of something new, rather than just focusing on just painting reality as it was. So when you look at Naked Lunch, which I think is probably the most well-known painting by Manet, you are looking at 3 figures. I think it's 3 in total. No, it's 4 in total. And you have 2 men and 2 women. And you can, they're really like, it's basically a realistic depiction of 2 men and 2 women. But then you look at the brushstrokes on how he paints the leaves and the grass and the scenery they're sitting having lunch at, and they're very not realistic at all. It's like these really long brushstrokes, and it's not meant to be a realistic portrayal of, you know, leaves and water, because one of the figures in the background is like washing herself in this like pond. It's more about, yeah, like doing an abstracted version of these elements,
or an impression of the environment.
yeah. Basically what impressionism is about is catching the light. So when you look at all these impressionist paintings, there's always like a very strong and like pinpointable source of light, and it's about how it's reflected in objects and, you know, like landscapes and all that. Basically, impressionists were also known for being the first movement of painters who took the canvas out of the studio and went to the place to actually paint. I don't know, like they would go to the woods and paint there to actually see how the sunlight was like touching the trees and all that.
By then, paint was available in tubes, so you no longer had to sit in the studio, have your little helper person mix up the paints. You just shoved the tubes in your bag and you went to paint in a field, and you could do it there and then.
Right. Mm-hmm. That's a very important point as well.
There's the idea of you don't have a lot of time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true.
Well,
because I think in the past it was more about going out, doing drawings of that place, coming back to your studio, and then rendering it like the way you wanted from what you had drawn, basically.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I think a good example of that idea of you don't have much time is a work that Monet made of the Notre Dame, and it's, I think, 20 different scenes of the Notre Dame.
I know what you're talking about,
different lighting situations.
It's at different times of the day, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very good example. Because so yeah, you can clearly see there that his focus was the different ways the building was being illuminated. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're really beautiful. Check it out.
Definitely.
Check it out.
Let us know what you think.
Yeah.
Follow him on Instagram.
But
Monet? Don't think he has Instagram, but
I think he's dead, by the way.
I think he's dead.
He might be, I'm not sure.
We haven't heard from him in a while. So.
Yeah. We did ask for an interview, but he hasn't replied.
Yeah.
We're focusing on Impressionism because it's a very good way of using examples for movements. But really, when you dive into each movement, they're like complete different worlds. And there's so much difference between each of them and the rules they apply and how they evolved. To me, it really, I don't know if this is a personal thing or, well, it's more of a sociological perspective of it. But to me, movements are this way of putting everything in boxes and tidy them, you know?
Yeah.
It's also perfectly fine and possible to look at art from outside of these boxes and look at Impressionists as this group that got a lot of attention at a given point in history. And now they are put together because of their focus in light and all this. But you can already see with the distinction between Monet and Manet that they were very different artists, one from the other. And although they share these characteristics, it is not wise to say they're Impressionists. That's it. Well, sadly, if you're studying history of arts, you have to. But
we can't be like Monet. Yeah, he was a bit more like Impressionist, and then I don't consider Manet an Impressionist. You know.
I mean, you can make a dissertation about it to put out your. But yeah, I mean, like after Impressionism, and then we obviously had a little period of Fauvism, and then it was Expressionism, which is basically again similar to Impressionism, but just loaded with a little bit more of emotions. It's kind of like a quest for authenticity of the artists themselves, I think.
Expressionism is another funny example because I think, if I'm not mistaken, the first big name of Expressionism was Van Gogh. And bear in mind that Van Gogh never sold a painting ever.
I think Van Gogh is in post-impression.
Is it post-expression? I think Van Gogh is already experienced it's already considered the first expressionist.
Triggers me when people go like, he never sold a painting.
Okay, he may have sold one or two, But
because it's always different. It's always like 1, 2, none. What
it
is
is
the answer?
impossible to know how many paintings he
Zero
sold.
and 2.
But
That's a trigger
In
subject
zero
for
and
me.
two.
the point is that he died in poverty, and he was not known until after he died.
Yeah, but then at the same time, he was pretty much like apparently funded by his brother.
Yeah.
Well, he
Kind
had to. He was doing nothing for him to earn money.
Work for gallery, which is technically the equivalent of you as an artist having a brother who works in, I don't know, the White Cube, and he would fund you.
Well,
That
it's a
sounds
tough.
like a dream, though.
Well, yeah, if you only could avoid shooting yourself in the tummy and having a slow death.
Supposedly, I've watched conspiracy theories, and I think someone shot him.
So, okay, so leaving that aside, the most accepted
Different
version of the
video.
story.
Different episode.
The most
mean-
accepted version of the story is that Van Gogh was, I think he was schizophrenic, or he was thought to be a schizophrenic. And he had a really huge, yes, whatever this is.
I was just trying to say, the two movements, they overlap as well. Like post-impressionism and expressionism, they overlap.
Well, I feel this is why Tate did that graph where everything's linked. But it's
Yeah.
just so impossible to, as Javier said, although we would like to box them in and have them all separate, it's just not possible. And
It
some
isn't, yeah.
artists, you know, they'll tell you, or you'll read back and they'll be like, I don't consider myself part of this movement, but yet, you know, they're still considered part of that movement.
Yeah.
Really embedded to think about movements and all these things as a sequence rather than a lot of things happening simultaneously.
Mhm.
And it is very, I mean, of course, you need a way to classify them, otherwise you're insane. That's how humans think. You label things and put them in groups. But it is worth making an effort to look at art as something like
A whole.
yeah, like it's just it grows so organically, so you cannot like contain it. It's rhizomatic, and we will have an episode about what that is.
I don't even know.
You
weren't there,
we
probably.
I'll find out.
we touched about that in class. So
Yeah, but
shame
you
on
probably were late
Probably
again with your
unwell
latte.
or had a different plan.
You were late
Or
with your latte, yeah.
I
So
was at a
listening to
sample
Britney.
sale.
So when we talk about rhizomatics, or we say that art is rhizomatic or anything is rhizomatic, we mean this concept. I think it's a philosophical concept in which
Right.
so rhizome in nature is this, it's like fungi, right? Like it's something that grows without a particular core or beginning, and it just expands in any direction, and you can cut a piece of it and it just regrows and it doesn't die. It's used as a metaphor because it's not like a plant where you have like the roots and all that, and if you cut it from the roots it dies. So the way you translate this metaphor into art is that if you think about art as a plant or a tree, you have all these movements that like kind of grow a previous one, and if you remove one from the equation, it kind of doesn't make sense to take the leap from the other two because there's no connection. If you look at art as a rhizomatic like thing, sorry for lack of a better concept or whatever, if you look at that as a rhizomatic thing, you don't see a movement as the like you don't see them as these puzzle pieces that have to fit in. So if you take away, you know, expressionism, you just you just look at those paintings from a different angle, and they can be late impressionism, or they can be, I don't know, you can say Van Gogh was an impressionist artist who put a lot of emotion into it, the same way you can say that Manet was an impressionist artist who put a lot of realism into it. It becomes way less logic to, you know, draw a evolution of art when you stop looking at it as something that has to go like in progression.
I also think it's important to know that although they build on top of one another, it's very much like a product of their time as well, and like what was going on in the world at that time. And I think maybe one of the reasons why there's such a quick turnover of movements in the last like 150 years is because there's just more, like there's more dispersing of media, so if word travels faster that things have happened, and people are able to connect like a little easier. This is even before like social media. It's just like you're able to come into contact with people a lot more. And sometimes I think like one of the good examples is like in Russia when there was the revolution in 1918. What was it? 16?
17.
Is it 17? And they were making art which was pro like Soviet and anti,
right,
you know, having being ruled by a royal family, all that. I hope I did a whole module on this and like cannot remember a single thing. But anyway, it's art which works as like propaganda for a cause. And now, although it was a poster at the time, you look back and go, oh, it's art. Like obviously, you know, that is such a product of what was going on at that specific time.
Right.
And movements, you can very much relate to like things that were going on in the world.
Yeah.
Right.
Not just building upon, you know, what the person in the movement before you was doing.
Yeah, that's a very good example actually, because that is an example of how you inorganically change movements. Instead of letting the artist just grow out of it, you just have this political regime that suddenly says this art is too difficult for the people to understand, and they like basically, you know,
it's not quite about this is too hard to understand, but it's like a lot of times it's about this art is too critical thinking provoking.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, of course.
I think they also just didn't want aesthetic, or at the time they just didn't want aesthetic art. They wanted art with a purpose, with a political message, with like something to drive things forward.
Yeah.
That's
when you look at like Soviet realism, which is the name of this movement of, you know, like all these paintings of like,
I think it's called socialist realism.
Ooh.
I always called it Soviet realism. Sorry, socialist realism, because of course it's also present in China, and so it makes sense. It's called socialist instead of Soviet. But point is that you're right. It's not only that it's easier for the people to understand it. It's also that when you put forward paintings that are meant for the people to be educated in order to fully grasp them, you're promoting people to think critically, and that is not very useful and recommended if you want to be a dictator. Dictatorship 101, always forbid critical arts.
Art.
Next episode. Dictatorship.
How to be a dictator with art. Yes.
I mean, we can also talk about how artists find ways to kind of dodge the bullet in terms of what the state wanted them to do.
Right.
Obviously,
that could actually be a very fun episode, though.
Yes.
Yeah. And also, we did like a lecture on Eastern Europe, how they, after they came out of it, what they do to present their work to this Western European centric art world, how they sort of present their art that is fundamentally charged with this Soviet political context. Anyway, I think because we're talking about socialist realism, it's also interesting how, because like since 1917, it kind of went on for a very long time, and it kind of also goes into World War II and post-World War II. And another example of how it really links together is that the rise of capitalist realism, which is a tiny little movement that was fundamentally in Germany, started in Dusseldorf, where Gerhard Richter, Sigmar Polke, and a few other artists who were in Dusseldorf, they basically really disliked American pop art because it was just this thing that was I think in their heads it kind of like infested the whole art world. So they wanted to do capitalist realism, like kind of like taking a joke on socialist realism, where they also use capitalist symbolism or capitalist icons and put them into their work. But then they don't make but it's more about the process of making, like the artist's process which they think is what makes art instead of mass producing works.
Mhm.
If there's
Yeah.
anything that was too confusing, we answer
Yeah.
questions.
Yes.
Feel
Please
free to
tweet
send us a
us,
DM.
DM us.
Add a Q&A and crack open a cold one.
Yeah,
We
we'll
can
do
always-
Q&A in future when we have enough views.
Thanks for watching, and please leave a comment if you want us to go more in depth in any particular movement. If you're interested in some concept we've touched upon, we'll be very happy to hear from it, and we will make an episode about it.
Hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it. If you especially loved our episode, we would love it if you gave it a 5-star rating and a review, and even consider taking a screenshot of this episode and posting it on your Instagram stories. That way we know that you loved it and other people can find our podcast as well. If you're not subscribed yet, again, what are you doing? Subscribe and get notified every time we publish a new episode. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook at chART Podcast, and if you want to see our faces while we talk, find us on YouTube at chART Podcast as well. We are chART, and we'll hope we'll meet you again at some point in the near future. Take care, chART out.
Love you.
See you.
Love
See you
you.
later.
Bye.
Bye.